Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. The sea is restless. Waves slap against the steel hull of a landing craft as men grip their rifles with white knuckles, their breath ragged in the salty air. Inside the boat, silence competes with the roar of engines. One Marine bends forward, losing his breakfast into the bilge, while another threads prayer beads through his trembling fingers. No one dares to look up. The horizon is nothing but smoke and fire. A thunderclap shakes the water. U.S. battleships have been shelling the shoreline for hours. The men cling to a hope that nothing, no bunker, no soldier, could have survived that bombardment. The helmsman's voice cuts through the din. "Stand by! Time to go ashore!" The ramp crashes down, not onto sand but against a concrete seawall. Splinters of a shattered ladder tumble into the boat's interior. Scrambling, the Marines throw themselves forward, clambering up the slick gray wall as enemy fire rattles above. But the sound is unfamiliar. It is not the staccato shriek of German MG-42s. Instead, it is the slower, guttural chug of Soviet-made machine guns. This is not Normandy. This is Incheon, Korea, September 1950. Barely 6 years after the beaches of France, another generation of Americans is again storming a coastline, again gambling their lives on the promise of turning the tide of war. The Korean War would never achieve the fame of D-Day, yet its opening scene carried the same desperate gamble, the same cinematic audacity. Here at Incheon, Douglas MacArthur wagered everything on an amphibious assault against impossible tides and fortified walls. And against all odds, the gamble would pay off. But the story of how U.S. Marines came to scale these seawalls begins not in 1950 but 5 years earlier, in the ashes of Japan's defeat. When the Empire of the Rising Sun finally surrendered in August 1945, its decades-long occupation of Korea collapsed overnight. The peninsula, long treated as a mere stepping stone for Japan's ambitions in Asia, suddenly stood at a crossroads. For the first time in 35 years, Koreans could imagine freedom. For the great powers, Korea was a prize to be divided. The Soviet Red Army swept down from the north, occupying territory with ruthless efficiency. Meanwhile, U.S. troops landed in the south, racing to establish control before their erstwhile allies did. They met at the 38th parallel, a line drawn hastily on a National Geographic map by junior American officers who had little idea of Korea's geography, much less its history. That accidental pencil stroke would carve the peninsula in two. In the north, Moscow found its man in Kim Il-sung, a partisan fighter who had resisted Japanese rule. Stalin's advisors elevated him from a little-known guerrilla to the face of a new communist state. In the south, Washington placed its trust in Syngman Rhee, a Princeton-educated nationalist whose fervent anti-communism promised loyalty to the U.S. Both men dreamed of uniting Korea under their own rule. Neither had patience for compromise. So when U.S. Marines hurled themselves against the seawalls of Incheon in 1950, they were not merely fighting for territory. They were clashing against the consequences of a divided world. The amphibious assault was more than a military maneuver. It was a symbol of the Cold War's first great gamble, a declaration that neither side intended to yield the future of Korea without a fight. The shadow of Normandy loomed large. Many of the Marines who leapt into the surf at Incheon carried memories of Europe or the Pacific in their bones. They had seen how quickly a landing could collapse into slaughter, how chaos could swallow entire units. And as they scrambled up the concrete wall, they could not know that this war, this police action, as it would be called, was about to spiral into one of the bloodiest and most forgotten conflicts of the 20th century. In August 1945, Korea awoke to liberation. But it was a liberation born in confusion. For 35 years, the Japanese Empire had ruled the peninsula with an iron fist. Generations of Koreans had been forced to bow to the rising sun, their language suppressed, their identity smothered beneath imperial decrees. Then, almost overnight, it ended. The atomic firestorms over Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought Japan to its knees, and with surrender came a power vacuum across its former empire. The Soviet Red Army moved first. Sweeping down from Manchuria, hardened troops poured across Korea's northern frontier. Entire Japanese garrisons, demoralized and cut off, surrendered en masse. Soviet tanks clattered into Korean towns, greeted by villagers unsure whether to celebrate or fear this new army. To the south, American planners scrambled. They had not expected to occupy Korea, but they knew one thing. They could not allow the Soviets to dominate the entire peninsula. It was in those frantic days that two U.S. colonels, Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel, sat in a dimly lit room with a map. With little more than a ruler and a deadline, they proposed the 38th parallel as the dividing line. It was arbitrary, chosen because it neatly split the country in two and left Seoul, the capital, in American hands. Astonishingly, Stalin accepted. Perhaps he believed the Americans would lose interest quickly. Perhaps he saw it as a temporary arrangement. Either way, that pencil line changed the fate of millions. The Soviets wasted no time shaping their zone. They needed a leader, someone both loyal to Moscow and palatable to Koreans. Their choice was Kim Il-sung, a guerrilla who had fought Japanese forces in Manchuria. Though little known in Korea itself, Kim had the one credential that mattered. He was a revolutionary steeped in communist ideology, and he owed his rise entirely to Soviet backing. By late 1945, Kim stood before cheering crowds in Pyongyang as Moscow's chosen heir. In the south, Washington faced a more difficult task. Korea had no established political system left intact after decades of occupation. The Americans turned to Syngman Rhee, a man who had spent most of his life in exile. Educated in the United States, Rhee spoke English fluently and radiated anti-communist zeal. To the U.S., he seemed reliable. To many Koreans, however, he was distant, a man who had returned from abroad with Western manners but little grasp of the struggles of those who had endured Japanese rule firsthand. Two governments began to take shape, each claiming to represent all Koreans, each preparing for the day when they could reunify the country by force. In Pyongyang, Kim built a provisional government infused with Stalinist discipline. Land reform redistributed estates to peasants, while political opponents disappeared into prison camps. In Seoul, Rhee consolidated power with equal determination, silencing critics and elevating himself as the savior of the nation. The irony was unmistakable. Both regimes spoke the language of liberation, of freedom from colonial oppression. But to ordinary Koreans, the promise of independence was already slipping away, traded instead for a new form of occupation. In the north, Soviet advisors filled government ministries. In the south, American military governors issued decrees from behind barbed wire compounds. The peninsula, once a single nation under foreign domination, was now two half-nations under the shadow of rival empires. On paper, it might have seemed temporary, a line drawn in haste to be erased later by negotiation. But in the hearts of Rhee and Kim, compromise was unthinkable. Each envisioned himself not as a regional leader, but as the rightful ruler of a unified Korea. Neither man imagined sharing power. The 38th parallel was not just a border, it was a fuse waiting to be lit. By the end of 1945, Koreans had celebrated liberation, buried their dead, and begun to adjust to life under new masters. Yet whispers ran through the villages and streets. Korea was free, yes, but free only to be torn in two. The dream of a free Korea quickly soured. What began as liberation turned into disillusionment as both halves of the peninsula revealed their true nature. On paper, the South was to be a republic, a democracy nurtured under American protection. In the North, Kim Il-sung promised a people's democracy, shaped by socialist ideals. Yet in practice, both systems bent quickly toward authoritarianism, each justifying repression as necessary for survival. In Seoul, the summer of 1948 brought the Republic of Korea's first national elections. To American observers, it was meant to be a triumph of democratic ideals in Asia, proof that Korea could chart its own path without Soviet influence. Yet the results were hardly inspiring. Syngman Rhee, Washington's favored candidate, won with a staggering 92.6% of the vote. Official tallies claimed overwhelming popular support, but in the streets people whispered of ballot stuffing, intimidation, and manipulated results. For many Koreans, the election felt less like liberation than a transfer of control, from Tokyo's colonial governors to a president who ruled with America's blessing. Rhee wasted little time consolidating his authority. Opposition figures who criticized his methods were branded traitors. Those accused of leftist sympathies faced arrest or worse. Villages suspected of harboring communists were punished collectively. The Jeju Uprising in 1948 became a grim symbol of this new order. On the island of Jeju, protests against Ri's regime escalated into open rebellion, fueled by communist elements but also by ordinary farmers resentful of government corruption. The response was merciless. South Korean security forces, aided by right-wing militias, unleashed a campaign of repression so brutal that entire villages were wiped from the map. By the time it ended, between 30,000 and 60,000 people, nearly a tenth of Jeju's population, lay dead. Washington looked on with unease. The United States had hoped for a showcase democracy, but Ri's republic bore a troubling resemblance to the very authoritarianism it claimed to resist. American officials began to describe it quietly as diet democracy, a thinner, weaker version tolerated only because the alternative was communism. Meanwhile, in the north, Kim Il-sung pursued his own vision of a tightly controlled state. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea was declared in September 1948. The name suggested openness, but the reality was iron-fisted rule. Kim elevated himself as the embodiment of Korea's revolutionary spirit, a guerrilla hero who had resisted Japanese oppression. In truth, his power rested heavily on Soviet support. Moscow's advisors trained his army, filled his ministries, and armed his police. Kim's government wasted no time reshaping society. Land reform broke apart large estates, redistributing fields to poor farmers. For many peasants, it was the first taste of ownership in generations, and it won Kim genuine loyalty. Yet dissent was not tolerated. Political opponents vanished into camps, show trials condemned traitors, and propaganda saturated every corner of daily life. The facade of socialism masked a system where one man's word became law. Both Ri and Kim shared one dangerous conviction, that their state was the only legitimate Korea. To Ri, the North was a renegade territory, illegally occupied by communists. To Kim, the South was a puppet regime, enslaved to imperialists. Each promised that reunification would come, but only under their own banner. Ordinary Koreans, caught between these visions, saw little room for hope. Families were split along the 38th parallel, their letters censored or blocked entirely. Traders who once crossed provinces freely now found themselves accused of espionage. The peninsula had not only been divided by geography, but by ideology. And in both halves, democracy became little more than a slogan, covering systems of fear, control, and relentless ambition. By the late 1940s, the fuse of war had already been lit. All it would take was a spark. The peninsula in the late 1940s was a tinderbox. Both Syngman Rhee in the south and Kim Il-sung in the north spoke openly of reunification, but through conquest, never compromise. Their visions could not coexist, and the line at the 38th parallel grew less like a border and more like a battlefield waiting to ignite. Rhee was the first to voice his intentions. To American envoys, he declared, without hesitation, that his ultimate goal was to march north, reunite the peninsula, and wipe communism from Korean soil. Yet his bold rhetoric was matched by ruthless action at home. He launched Soviet-style purges against suspected leftists, ordering arrests and executions that bled into the countryside. The Jeju massacre had already shocked the nation, but more crackdowns followed in regions accused of harboring Reds. Tens of thousands perished, not in battles against foreign armies, but at the hands of their own government. Across the 38th parallel, Kim Il-sung was also preparing for war. His speeches to the Politburo dripped with confidence. The South, he argued, was weak and divided. Its people longed for liberation. If the North struck swiftly, he promised, the entire peninsula could be under Pyongyang's control before the Americans had time to respond. Yet Kim needed more than ambition. He needed the blessing and the weapons of his patrons in Moscow and Beijing. So he courted Stalin. In a series of visits and telegrams, Kim pressed his case. The South Korean army was poorly trained, its arsenal outdated, its American allies disinterested. A single strike, he argued, will collapse their defenses. Stalin hesitated. The Soviet dictator had little desire to provoke direct war with the United States. But he also saw an opportunity. If the Americans truly lacked the will to fight, then a communist Korea would be a powerful prize in the Cold War's opening act. Meanwhile, Mao Zedong watched warily from across the Yalu River. China had only just emerged from its own civil war, exhausted and bloodied. But Mao, too, understood the stakes. A unified Korea under communism would serve as a buffer for China's fragile new state. A unified Korea under American influence, on the other hand, would place U.S. troops directly on China's border. While leaders plotted, the military balance tilted dangerously. In late 1949, the United States withdrew its last combat troops from Korea. Washington believed that the Republic of Korea Army, ROKA, could handle domestic unrest and border skirmishes on its own. But the reality was bleak. The ROKA was small, poorly equipped, and barely trained. Its soldiers carried Second World War leftovers, bolt-action rifles, and a handful of mortars. They had almost no tanks, no effective anti-armor weapons, and only limited artillery. Kim's army was a different story. With Soviet advisors, the Korean People's Army was reorganized into a modern fighting force, equipped with artillery, automatic weapons, and above all, tanks. 150 T-34-85s, the same machines that had rolled through Berlin just 5 years earlier. To the north, barracks filled with soldiers drilling day and night. To the south, conscripts struggled to find boots that fit. Rhee continued to shout about reunification, but even his American backers knew it was bluster. The Pentagon had little faith in the ROKA's ability to defend itself, let alone invade the north. When U.S. generals assessed the Korean theater, the conclusion was stark. Only one division in the entire U.S. Army, the 82nd Airborne, was combat ready, and it was half a world away. The storm was gathering, and both sides knew it. The border bristled with skirmishes, raids, and propaganda battles. Villages near the 38th parallel lived in constant fear. One day under the watch of Southern soldiers, the next under the Northern patrols who slipped across the line. For ordinary Koreans, it felt less like peace and more like a lull before a hurricane. And in Pyongyang, Kim Il-sung grew convinced that his moment had come. Dawn broke on June 25, 1950, with a thunder that shook the entire peninsula. From the northern hills came the grinding roar of engines, tanks, hundreds of them, rolling south. The ground trembled under their treads as columns of T-34-85s surged across the 38th parallel. Behind them, waves of infantry marched in lockstep, their bayonets gleaming in the pale morning light. The Korean People's Army struck with overwhelming force. 150 Soviet-supplied tanks spearheaded the assault, backed by artillery barrages that shattered Arok positions before dawn. Villages along the border woke to a hell of fire and steel. South Korean defenses, scattered and ill-prepared, buckled almost immediately. The ROKA had rifles, a few mortars, and courage, but no effective anti-tank weapons. Farmers with ox carts watched helplessly as armored columns smashed through the roads that once carried their harvests. Civilians fled in panic, carrying bundles of clothes, photographs, and whatever little food they could gather, streaming south in chaotic rivers of humanity. In Seoul, confusion reigned. At first, government officials dismissed reports of a northern invasion as mere skirmishes, routine provocations along the border. But by the afternoon, it was undeniable. The North was not testing the South, it was devouring it. Within hours, the KPA seized Kaesong and then pushed rapidly toward Uijeongbu, the gateway to Seoul. South Korean units tried to resist, but poor communication turned their efforts into chaos. Orders contradicted each other. Entire regiments fell back without firing a shot. One division, cut off from its commanders, fought desperately with rifles and grenades until the tanks simply rolled over their positions. Seoul, the beating heart of the South, trembled at the approach of the Northern Army. Refugees clogged every road leading away from the city, wagons overturned in the frantic rush. Mothers carried infants on their backs while pulling children by the hand, only to lose them in the crush. At the Han River, bridges overflowed with terrified civilians and soldiers trying to retreat. The government of Syngman Rhee faltered. In the face of catastrophe, Rhee ordered key ministries evacuated but delayed telling the public. At night, he himself fled across the Han, leaving behind a city teetering on the edge of collapse. Hours later, demolition teams blew up the main bridge to slow the advancing KPA. Hundreds of civilians still on the crossing were killed instantly in the explosion. On June 27th, just 2 days after the invasion began, Seoul fell. The northern flag was raised over the capital as North Korean soldiers paraded through its wide boulevards. To the people of the city, the world had turned upside down in the span of a weekend. Far away in Washington, news trickled in slowly. It was late evening before the Secretary of Defense was briefed, and even then, he hesitated. At first, he instructed General Douglas MacArthur simply to investigate the situation, then went back to sleep. The reality of the invasion had not yet sunk in for American leaders. But on the ground in Korea, there was no mistaking it. A full-scale war had begun. The first blows had landed, and the Republic of Korea was already on the brink of annihilation. The fall of Seoul was more than a military defeat. It was a psychological shock. Within 48 hours, the government had abandoned the capital, bridges lay shattered in the river, and the Northern Army marched triumphantly through streets that had flown American and South Korean flags only days before. For ordinary citizens, it was bewildering. How could their leaders speak of reunification, of strength and destiny, when their defenses had melted away like morning mist? The Republic of Korea army tried to resist, but the effort was chaotic at best. General Choi Byung-duk, the ROK chief of staff, faced disaster on every front. His counterattack east of Wujongbu, intended to buy time, disintegrated almost immediately. Poor communications left units isolated. Divisions that were supposed to act together moved separately, often in opposite directions. One battalion advanced without orders, stumbled directly into North Korean armor, and was obliterated in minutes. The 1st Division, cut off from reinforcements, fought with extraordinary courage. Armed with little more than rifles and grenades, they stood their ground against the thunder of advancing tanks. For 2 days they held, their lines collapsing inch by inch, until the survivors faced the inevitable, retreat or annihilation. Che, however, issued a final command: hold at all costs. It was an order that condemned men to die in positions already doomed. Meanwhile, President Ri's behavior worsened the chaos. His flight from Seoul was swift and secretive, leaving citizens abandoned to face the enemy without leadership. When the Han River Bridge was demolished to delay the northern advance, hundreds of civilians crowded on it were blown apart in the explosion. Survivors watched the smoke rise and realized bitterly that their own government had sacrificed them. With the capital lost, the only hope lay in American intervention. But the U.S. military presence in Asia had dwindled since 1949. Only scattered occupation forces remained in Japan, and they were poorly equipped for combat. When General Douglas MacArthur ordered reinforcements, the first to arrive was a single understrength battalion hastily assembled into what became known as Task Force Smith. On July 5th, just north of Osan, this force made its stand. Barely 500 men, armed with outdated bazookas, mortars, and Second World War rifles, dug in against an oncoming column of North Korean armor. The Americans waited in silence until the first T-34 appeared on the horizon. Then they opened fire. Bazooka rockets bounced harmlessly off the tank's armor. Mortar rounds fell short. The tanks kept coming, their machine guns cutting swaths through the thin American line. Task Force Smith held for hours, but they were never meant to succeed. Nearly half the men were killed or captured. Yet their sacrifice was not meaningless. Their delay, brief as it was, bought precious time for the rest of the 24th Infantry Division to establish positions further south. But that first American engagement also revealed a grim truth. The U.S. Army was unprepared. Its weapons were antiquated, its units scattered, its leadership complacent after 5 years of peacetime downsizing. Korea would not be a quick skirmish. It was becoming a full war, and the South, left on its own, had nearly collapsed before the Americans could even find their footing. As refugees flooded south, the roadways became rivers of human suffering. Children clung to parents too weary to carry them. Families abandoned carts and livestock on the roadside as the northern advance pressed ever closer. For many, there was no plan, no destination, only the desperate hope of outrunning the war. By the second week of July, it was clear. The Republic of Korea had been saved from total destruction not by its own strength, but by time. Time paid for in blood at Osan and in the chaos of retreat. And even that reprieve might not last. The North Korean juggernaut showed no signs of slowing, and the line of retreat was narrowing toward a single shrinking corner of the peninsula. By mid-July 1950, the Republic of Korea was a nation in retreat. The Northern Army had swallowed Seoul, driven the ROK divisions into disarray, and sent civilians fleeing in endless caravans of misery. What remained of the South shrank smaller each day until only a narrow corner of the peninsula was left unconquered, a perimeter around the port of Pusan. It was here, at the southeastern tip of Korea, that the fate of the war was decided. If Pusan fell, the South would vanish in a matter of weeks, but if it held, the world might have time to respond. The Pusan perimeter stretched nearly 140 miles, a defensive arc hastily carved into the landscape. Behind it lay the last sanctuary for refugees, the only functioning harbor for reinforcements, and the desperate hope of an entire nation. American and South Korean forces dug in, stringing barbed wire across rice paddies, fortifying hills with sandbags, and carving trenches into the earth. Supplies trickled in through Pusan's docks, unloaded by exhausted stevedores who knew they were fighting time as much as the enemy. North Korean commanders recognized the stakes. On August 4th, they hurled their forces against the line in a massive assault. Waves of infantry surged across rivers under cover of night. Tanks roared forward, their guns pounding the earth, while Soviet-supplied artillery rained down on dug-in positions. The defenders answered with everything they had: artillery, mortars, even bayonets in close combat. The fiercest clash came along the Naktong River. Here, North Korea committed its elite units, men hardened by years of guerrilla struggle, supported by armor and heavy guns. They forced a crossing, carving a dangerous bulge into the perimeter that became known as the Naktong Bulge. For days, the line wavered on the edge of collapse. Entire companies were overrun. American commanders feared the breakthrough would unravel the defense entirely. But reinforcements arrived at the last moment. Fresh battalions rushed to the river, throwing themselves into the fight. Artillery batteries hammered the crossing sites. Overhead, American aircraft strafed columns of troops and obliterated supply convoys winding through the hills. The sky itself became a weapon. By late August, the North Korean advance stalled. For the first time in the war, the momentum shifted. The North Koreans had stretched themselves too far. Their supply lines, vulnerable to U.S. air power, withered under relentless bombardment. Bridges collapsed into rivers, fuel convoys went up in flames, and hungry soldiers scavenged for food in villages already stripped bare. Yet the battle was no clean victory. The perimeter was a furnace that consumed men. American casualties mounted in the thousands. South Korean losses were even greater. Entire units ground down to remnants. Refugees poured into Pusan itself, swelling the city to twice its normal size, its streets overflowing with tents, carts, and makeshift shelters. Disease spread quickly, and hunger gnawed at the displaced. For them, the perimeter was not just a line of defense, it was the edge of the world. Still, the line held. Against all odds, the defenders of the Pusan perimeter had bought what seemed impossible just weeks before: time. Time for ships to arrive, bringing tanks, artillery, and fresh divisions from Japan and across the Pacific. Time for America's industrial might to turn its attention back to war. Time for General MacArthur to hatch a plan so audacious that even his staff thought it madness. The perimeter had not been broken, but it could not hold forever. If the war was to be turned, it would take more than defense. It would take a gamble worthy of legend. The Pusan perimeter held, but just barely. Soldiers were exhausted, reinforcements thin, and supplies stretched to the breaking point. Everyone knew the truth. They could not stand on the defensive forever. To win the war, something audacious had to be done. Enter General Douglas MacArthur. To his admirers, he was a titan, brilliant, flamboyant, almost untouchable. To his critics, he was reckless, arrogant, and dangerously theatrical. But one fact was undeniable. He thought bigger than anyone else. And in the summer of 1950, he unveiled a plan that seemed closer to madness than strategy. His idea was simple in concept, impossible in practice. A massive amphibious landing behind enemy lines at the port of Incheon, more than 100 miles northwest of the front. By striking there, MacArthur hoped to sever the North Korean army's supply lines, trap it between the hammer of UN forces advancing from Pusan and the anvil of Marines storming the coast. It was, in essence, a second D-Day. But the obstacles were immense. Incheon was one of the least suitable landing sites imaginable. Its harbor was narrow and heavily defended, surrounded by mudflats that stretched for miles at low tide. The tidal swings themselves were legendary, rising and falling nearly 30 feet within hours. Any landing craft caught in the wrong moment would be stranded in the muck, easy prey for artillery. Even if the Marines reached shore, they would face towering seawalls and fortified strongpoints bristling with guns. When MacArthur presented the plan to his staff, most were horrified. Senior officers lined the table with their objections. The tides were too dangerous, the harbor too narrow, the city too heavily defended. One commander bluntly called it not feasible. MacArthur listened in silence, puffing on his pipe, letting the doubts mount. Then, when all had spoken, he delivered his verdict. The very arguments you have made as to the impracticability involved will tend to ensure for me the element of surprise. It was pure MacArthur, bold, defiant, and absolute. No enemy, he reasoned, would expect an attack so foolish. And that was precisely why it would succeed. Washington hesitated, but in the end they gave him the green light. Preparations began in secret. Marines drilled endlessly in Japan, rehearsing assaults against mock seawalls. Naval convoys gathered, assembling the might of an international coalition. Pilots memorized flight paths, preparing to rain fire across the landing zones. In early September, the gamble was set in motion. As dawn broke on September 15th, a thunderous barrage shook the earth. U.S. battleships and cruisers pounded Incheon's defenses, their shells tearing concrete and steel apart. The sky filled with aircraft roaring low over the city, dropping bombs that turned strong points into smoldering ruins. Then came the landing craft, surging through the surf, packed with Marines grimly clutching their rifles. In the spray and smoke, the moment felt hauntingly familiar. To many veterans on those boats, it was as though Normandy had returned, another desperate gamble across another hostile shore. The gamble of Incheon had begun. The landing at Incheon was a thunderclap. By nightfall, the Marines had scaled the seawalls, broken through the defenses, and seized the port against all odds. North Korean troops reeled in disbelief. How could the enemy appear 100 miles behind their front lines? Their carefully stretched supply network snapped almost overnight. MacArthur's audacity had paid off. Now came the second blow. Seoul. The city had been under North Korean control for nearly 3 months, its people living under the banners of the Red Star. Propaganda blasted from loudspeakers. Citizens were conscripted into militias, some forced to denounce neighbors as collaborators. Yet beneath the surface, resentment simmered. Rumors spread that the Americans were coming back, that liberation was only days away. But liberation would not come easily. Seoul was not just a prize, it was a fortress. North Korean commanders understood the symbolic power of the capital and resolved to defend it to the last man. Trenches and bunkers scarred the approaches. Machine guns were positioned to sweep entire streets. Even airfields became strongpoints, their hangars fortified with sandbags and barbed wire. As the UN advance closed in, the fighting grew savage. Artillery pounded block after block, turning neighborhoods into rubble. Tanks rolled cautiously down shattered avenues, their machine guns spraying into windows where snipers waited. Marines carried flamethrowers, clearing bunkers with sheets of fire. The air stank of smoke and charred wood. Survivors remembered the city as an inferno where every corner hid death. House-to-house combat bled the streets. One platoon spent an entire day taking a single intersection, trading grenades across alleyways, advancing by yards. The sound of battle was constant, machine guns echoing through concrete canyons, the thunder of bombs falling in the distance. Civilians huddled in basements, trapped between two armies, listening as war clawed its way through their homes. By September 28th, after days of unrelenting struggle, the city was finally secured. UN forces raised their flags over government buildings, and MacArthur himself staged a triumphant ceremony, presenting Seoul back to Syngman Rhee. The cameras captured victory, the smiles, the salutes, the sense that the tide of war had turned. Yet beneath the celebration lay a harsher truth. Seoul's liberation had come at a heavy cost. Nearly 300 Americans lay dead, alongside thousands of North Korean defenders and untold numbers of civilians caught in the crossfire. The city itself was scarred, buildings reduced to hollow shells, its people traumatized by occupation and battle alike. Still, the mood among UN soldiers was buoyant. The impossible had been achieved. Korea had not only been saved from collapse, it had struck back with stunning force. The invaders who once seemed unstoppable were now retreating in panic, their lines shredded, their morale broken. Victory was sweet, but it carried with it a dangerous question. What next? Should the UN stop at the 38th parallel, restoring the pre-war border, or press the advantage northward, seeking to unify the peninsula once and for all? It was a question that would define the next phase of the war and awaken forces far beyond Korea's borders. The banners of victory still fluttered over Seoul, but the war's course was already shifting again. What had begun as desperate defense at Pusan had become a roaring counteroffensive. The North Korean army, once so confident, now staggered in retreat. The question was no longer survival, it was opportunity. For General MacArthur, the answer was obvious. The enemy was broken, its supply lines in tatters, its morale shattered. Why stop at the 38th parallel? Why settle for restoring the old division of Korea when total victory was within reach? He envisioned not just a liberated South, but a unified peninsula, a Korea free of communism, standing as a beacon of American resolve in Asia. Syngman Rhee needed no convincing. For years he had dreamed of marching north, of claiming Pyongyang and erasing Kim Il-sung's regime from the map. Now, with American divisions at his back, that dream seemed tantalizingly close. To him, anything less than reunification would be a betrayal of Korea's sacrifice. But in Washington and London, caution crept into the discussion. The mission, as authorized by the United Nations, was to repel aggression, not to cross into the north. Intelligence warned of Chinese unease. Mao Zedong had watched the Incheon Landing with alarm, knowing that U.S. forces driving north would bring them directly to the Yalu River and China's doorstep. And Stalin, though more cautious, would hardly watch idly if communism was extinguished in Korea. Yet momentum had its own gravity. In the flush of victory, doubts seemed small compared to the promise of ending the war swiftly. By October, the decision was made. UN forces would cross the 38th parallel. The advance began with astonishing speed. In Pyongyang, Kim Il-sung's regime crumbled. Once feared soldiers deserted in droves. Civilians who had been fed propaganda of inevitable victory now watched in disbelief as American tanks rolled through their villages. On October 19th, Pyongyang itself fell with almost no resistance. For the first time since the invasion began, the North Korean capital was in enemy hands. The images were dramatic. UN troops hoisting their flags, columns of prisoners herded south, Pyongyang streets lined with exhausted civilians who no longer cheered or resisted, but simply endured. To soldiers on the ground, it felt as though the war might truly be over before winter. Letters home spoke of Christmas in Seoul, of victory parades, of families reunited across the border. But others sensed unease. Reports trickled in of Chinese troop movements near the Yalu River. Refugees whispered of unfamiliar accents among soldiers seen in the mountains. Pilots spotted bridges being repaired under cover of night. MacArthur dismissed the warnings, confident that China would never dare confront the full might of the U.S. military. "They will not intervene," he declared, with characteristic certainty. And so the advance pressed on, deeper into the north, closer to the Yalu with every mile. Victory seemed within reach, but victory had a way of blinding men to the storm building on the horizon. The fall of Pyongyang seemed to signal the end. UN troops marched through the streets, weary but triumphant, convinced that Korea would soon be whole again. MacArthur promised a final push to the Yalu River, the northernmost boundary of the peninsula. Letters from the front carried a hopeful refrain, "Home by Christmas." But on the far side of that river, another army stirred. China had watched the conflict unfold with growing alarm. Mao Zedong's revolution was barely a year old, his government still fragile after decades of civil war. The last thing Beijing wanted was American troops parked on its border. artillery within range of Manchuria, bombers poised to strike Chinese cities. To Mao, Korea was not a distant battlefield. It was a shield, a buffer that could not be allowed to collapse. At first, Mao hesitated. China was exhausted. Millions of his soldiers were still recovering from the brutal campaigns against Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists. Food was scarce, the economy fragile, the nation still rebuilding. But Kim Il-sung's pleas grew desperate. His army had been shattered, his capital lost, his regime clinging to survival. If China did not act, North Korea would vanish. So Mao made his choice. In October 1950, under a cloak of secrecy, the People's Volunteer Army began crossing the Yalu. They came at night, columns of men slipping across pontoon bridges and mountain trails, their footsteps muffled, their orders whispered. They carried little more than rifles and rice bowls, yet their numbers swelled by the tens of thousands. By month's end, nearly 300,000 Chinese soldiers had entered Korea, unseen by the world. Their first strike came at Unsan. On October 25th, Chinese forces struck UN troops with sudden ferocity. Entire battalions were surrounded in the dark, their radios jammed, their flanks collapsing under wave after wave of attackers. Survivors spoke of eerie horns blaring across the hills, followed by the pounding of boots and the thunder of gunfire. The shock was total. Units that had believed themselves advancing into a broken enemy now found themselves encircled by a force they never expected. Then, just as suddenly, the Chinese withdrew. They melted back into the mountains, leaving confusion in their wake. Some UN officers dismissed the attack as an isolated clash. Volunteers, perhaps, or remnants of North Korean units. MacArthur himself waved off the reports. China, he insisted, would not intervene in force. He saw no reason to halt his advance. But in Beijing, the decision was already made. Mao was committed. The sleeping giant had awakened, and its vast armies were now pouring into Korea. The UN's triumph at Pyongyang was not the war's end, but the beginning of a new and far deadlier chapter. The Christmas promise of victory was about to freeze into a nightmare. The autumn advance into North Korea had begun with triumph. Convoys rolled north, banners fluttered from captured towns, and MacArthur spoke confidently of victory by Christmas. Yet as November deepened, the mountains grew colder, the skies harsher, and the optimism of the UN advance began to wither in the face of a new reality. At the Chosin Reservoir, a vast man-made lake ringed by jagged peaks, U.S. Marines and Army units dug into positions under a sky that promised only snow and silence. Temperatures plunged to 30 degrees, 22 degrees. Weapons froze in soldiers' hands, lubricants thickened into useless sludge, and boots stiffened into blocks of ice. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes long before the enemy arrived, but the enemy was already there, watching, waiting. Mao's People's Volunteer Army had poured across the Yalu in numbers few UN commanders dared believe. By late November, more than 120,000 Chinese soldiers encircled the 30,000-strong U.S. X-Corps. They moved like shadows in the mountains, slipping along ridgelines, their padded uniforms blending into the snow. At night, the stillness shattered with the haunting sound of horns, drums, and shouted war cries. On November 27th, the trap snapped shut. Wave after wave of Chinese troops descended on the frozen camps, their sheer numbers overwhelming the Americans' scattered defenses. Mortar fire lit up the night sky, shells bursting in the snow with sickening thuds. Marines fought desperately to hold their lines, machine guns chattering until barrels glowed red in the sub-zero cold. The battle quickly devolved into survival. Units were cut off, surrounded, forced into desperate retreats down icy roads littered with wrecked vehicles. Ammunition froze. Medical supplies shattered like glass. Men wounded in combat often died before medics could reach them, their blood crystallizing in the freezing air. Yet amidst the horror, discipline held. The Marines fought their way out in what became one of the most remarkable fighting withdrawals in history. Inch by inch, mile by mile, they carved a corridor south, carrying their dead and wounded with them, refusing to leave anyone behind. They called themselves the Chosen Few, a bitter play on words that captured both their pride and their suffering. For 17 days, they marched and fought, encircled yet unbroken. Convoys crept down treacherous mountain roads, ambushed at every turn. Chinese forces hurled themselves at the retreating columns, only to be met with relentless American firepower, artillery, airstrikes, and the grit of soldiers determined to survive. By mid-December, the survivors reached the port of Hungnam, where an enormous evacuation awaited. Nearly 100,000 troops, along with an even greater number of Korean civilians, were pulled out by sea in one of the largest amphibious rescues in history. For many refugees, it was their last chance to escape the tide of war. They boarded ships with little more than the clothes on their backs, leaving homes they would never see again. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir was no victory. It was a test of endurance, a crucible of ice and fire that revealed the true scale of China's intervention. The UN coalition had not only been beaten back, they had been shown that their enemy was vast, relentless, and willing to bleed endlessly to defend Korea's northern frontier. MacArthur's dream of victory by Christmas lay buried in the snowdrifts of Chosin. The war, far from ending, was entering its most bitter phase. The road south from Chosin was long, bitter, and unforgiving. By December 1950, the UN coalition was in full retreat. The dream of reunifying Korea had dissolved into chaos. What had begun as triumph now became humiliation. The first blow came with the loss of Pyongyang. The capital, seized so easily in October, was abandoned barely 2 months later. Chinese forces surged through the valleys and mountain passes, their columns seemingly endless, while exhausted UN troops scrambled to hold any kind of defensive line. Entire villages emptied as civilians fled before the advancing tide, trudging south in freezing winds, carts creaking under what little they could carry. For the soldiers, the retreat was a nightmare of cold and confusion. U.S. convoys choked the roads, headlights dimmed to slits as trucks ground slowly through snowstorms. Vehicles broke down and were set ablaze to prevent capture. Ammunition dumps were detonated in fiery bursts, leaving black scars across the white landscape. What had been an advance of confidence became a rout of desperation. Then came tragedy at the highest level. On December 23rd, Lieutenant General Walton Walker, the commander of the U.S. 8th Army, was killed in a Jeep accident as he raced between collapsing fronts. His sudden death sent shockwaves through the ranks. Morale, already fragile, crumbled further. Soldiers whispered that the war itself was cursed, that even their leaders could not escape its grip. Into this crisis stepped General Matthew Ridgway, summoned to take command. He was a different figure from MacArthur, less theatrical, more grounded. Where others spoke of despair, Ridgway spoke of discipline, firepower, and resolve. He made it his first act to visit frontline units, trudging through the snow with grenades hanging from his harness, a visible reminder that he shared their risks. Soldiers later recalled how his presence steadied them, as though a man of iron had stepped into the storm. But even Ridgway could not stop the tide immediately. In January 1951, the Chinese launched another massive offensive. Seoul, liberated, lost, and liberated again, fell for the third time. Its citizens endured the bitter cycle yet again. Flags torn down, replaced, then torn down once more. Families who had clung to hope in September now found themselves under new masters, wondering how many more times their city could change hands before it was destroyed completely. The retreat was not only military, but psychological. The aura of U.S. invincibility, so carefully cultivated since 1945, lay shattered in the Korean snow. MacArthur, once hailed as a savior, was now accused of hubris. His bold push to the Yalu had awakened China's fury, and his promises of home by Christmas mocked the reality of soldiers freezing in the hills and civilians burying their dead. For the men on the ground, humiliation was measured not in grand strategy, but in daily suffering. Rations froze into blocks of ice. Frostbite gnawed at fingers until rifles could not be held. Soldiers carried their wounded through blizzards, only to see them perish from cold before reaching aid. Columns of refugees clogged every route, their presence both a reminder of what they fought for and a burden that slowed every movement. By early 1951, the UN coalition was in tatters. Seoul had fallen, the Chinese advance seemed unstoppable, and the world looked on in disbelief. Less than 6 months earlier, Korea had been a forgotten peninsula. Now it was a battlefield where the world's greatest powers bled openly, humiliated by the ferocity of a war no one had truly wanted. Yet amidst the ruin, a spark remained. With Ridgway at the helm, the coalition had not broken completely. The Chinese had pushed them south, but at terrible cost. And behind the lines, new divisions, new weapons, and new strategies were being readied. The humiliation of winter would not be the final word. The winter of 1950-51 had been a season of humiliation. Seoul lost for the third time, UN forces battered into retreat, the Chinese seemingly unstoppable. Yet war is rarely a straight line. What looks like collapse one month can, with the right leadership and resources, become resurgence the next. And in Korea, that resurgence began with a single man, General Matthew Ridgway. Ridgway was not MacArthur. He wore no corncob pipe, staged no grand theatrics. What he brought instead was grit, hard, steady, unshakable. Where others spoke of defeat, Ridgway spoke of firepower. He knew that US technology, artillery, and air dominance were unmatched. The problem was not strength, but spirit. So he set about rebuilding it. He walked the lines, grenades strapped to his chest, refusing to hide in headquarters. He ate the same rations as his men, endured the same cold, and reminded them that they were not beaten, that they were soldiers of the most powerful army in the world, and they still held the tools to prove it. Slowly, morale shifted. What had felt like a broken retreat hardened into stubborn resistance. The first real test came in early 1951 with Operation Thunderbolt. Ridgway unleashed a massive counteroffensive south of Seoul, backed by relentless air power. Jet fighters and bombers pounded Chinese supply routes, turning bridges into twisted steel and convoys into flaming wrecks. Artillery barrages rumbled across the hills, shaking the earth for miles. Then infantry advanced methodically, clawing back ground that had been lost in the winter chaos. The Chinese, exhausted from weeks of relentless campaigning, began to falter. Their supply lines stretched thin, their soldiers half-starved in the bitter cold. For every division they threw forward, Ridgway met them with walls of firepower. Slowly, the tide began to turn. In March, Operation Ripper drove UN forces north once more, culminating in the fourth and final battle for Seoul. The city, battered and burned from months of shifting control, changed hands yet again. But this time, the UN held it. Chinese counterattacks broke against entrenched defenses, their casualties mounting by the thousands. The front stabilized, not far from where the war had begun, along the weary line of the 38th parallel. For the men on the ground, the change was palpable. Gone was the sense of endless retreat. Instead, there was confidence, tempered by experience, hardened by loss, but confidence nonetheless. Soldiers spoke not of home by Christmas, but of holding their ground, of outlasting the enemy through sheer fire and steel. For the Chinese, the reality was harsher. They had entered Korea with surprise and momentum, but now faced an opponent dug in, supplied by one of the richest nations on earth, and shielded by skies they could not contest. Every offensive cost them dearly. Every gain was measured in bodies. The war had become not a sprint, but a grind. By the summer of 1951, it was clear. Korea would not be won in a lightning strike. It would be fought hill by hill, trench by trench, a brutal war of attrition. The tide had turned, but not toward victory, only toward stalemate. By mid-1951, the war had lost its lightning pace. Gone were the sweeping offensives that had carried armies from Pusan to Pyongyang and back again. In their place came something darker, more grinding, a stalemate of trenches, bunkers, and endless slaughter. The front line hardened roughly along the 38th parallel, the same line first drawn in 1945, now carved into the earth with blood. Hills became fortresses. Valleys became killing grounds. Each side dug deep, stringing barbed wire across ridge lines, laying mines along narrow passes, and fortifying bunkers with sandbags and timber. The terrain, once fields and villages, became scar tissue. Here, battles were not decided by sweeping maneuvers, but by inches. Hilltops with no name became infamous, their slopes soaked in blood. Porkchop Hill, Heartbreak Ridge, White Horse Mountain, each a patch of ground that changed hands again and again, seized at horrific cost, abandoned, and then fought over once more. Soldiers joked grimly that the hills must be cursed, for they demanded sacrifice, but offered nothing in return. The combat was relentless. UN artillery rained down day and night, its thunder rolling across valleys. American bombers darkened the skies, leveling North Korean towns until they resembled moonscapes. Yet the Chinese and North Koreans refused to break. Wave after wave of infantry assaults crashed against UN lines, often at night, their horns and whistles echoing through the darkness before the storm of gunfire began. Bodies piled along barbed wire, frozen in grotesque shapes by the morning frost. For soldiers in the trenches, the war became an endless cycle of patrols, firefights, and waiting. Mud in the spring, dust in the summer, ice in the winter. Letters from home spoke of a world that had moved on, while here time seemed trapped, measured only in the number of comrades lost. Survival was not measured in victories, but in days endured. Civilians, too, paid a heavy price. Villages caught between the lines were obliterated. Families who had fled once or twice now found themselves refugees for a third time, wandering through landscapes where even the rivers ran black with ash. Hunger and disease claimed as many lives as bullets. The stalemate was costly for all sides. For the United States, the casualty lists lengthened with no promise of decisive victory. For China, every offensive drained its manpower. Young peasants from distant provinces buried on Korean slopes they had never heard of before. For North and South Koreans, the cost was incalculable, a homeland shattered, a nation broken, its soil turned into a graveyard. The front had frozen, but the slaughter had not. By the summer of 1951, the front lines of Korea had hardened into an iron scar across the peninsula. Neither side could break the other. The battlefield had become static, but the war did not end. Instead, it shifted to a new theater, the negotiating table. Peace talks began in the small village of Kaesong and later moved to Panmunjom. Delegates from the United Nations Command and from North Korea, backed by China, sat across from each other in dimly lit rooms, their words as sharp as any blade. The goal was simple in theory, an armistice to end the fighting. Yet in practice, every issue became a battlefield of pride and ideology. The first obstacle was the line itself. Where should the ceasefire boundary be drawn? The North demanded a return to the 38th parallel, erasing UN gains. The UN demanded the line reflect the current positions, giving the South a stronger hand. Maps were spread across tables, fingers stabbing at rivers and ridgelines, arguments stretching into days. Outside, soldiers continued to die on those very hills the diplomats debated. Then came the thorniest issue of all: prisoners of war. Tens of thousands of North Korean and Chinese captives languished in southern camps. When asked if they wished to be repatriated, many refused, terrified of returning to regimes that would treat them as traitors. Some requested asylum in the south, others asked to go to Taiwan. For the UN, the principle was clear: no prisoner should be forced back against his will. For the communists, it was humiliation. To admit that their own soldiers would rather live under their enemy was unthinkable. The deadlock stretched on. Negotiations stalled, collapsed, resumed, and stalled again. At times, the talks became farcical. Delegates quibbled over the shape of the conference table, over which flags could be displayed, over the seating arrangements. Weeks were lost to ceremonial disputes while the front remained soaked in blood. Meanwhile, public opinion strained under the weight of endless war. In the United States, families asked why their sons were dying for hills with names no one could find on a map. In China, Mao's government concealed the true casualty lists, but whispers spread of villages emptied of young men. In South Korea, Syngman Rhee thundered against any settlement that left the peninsula divided, insisting he would never accept an armistice short of total victory. Yet the soldiers had no such luxury of rhetoric. They fought on through the endless stalemate, their battles serving little purpose but to strengthen bargaining positions at the table. At night, men wondered aloud why they were still dying when peace was being discussed, only a few miles away. The irony was bitter. The diplomats sought to end the war, yet their stubbornness prolonged it. Each side feared the appearance of weakness more than the reality of slaughter. And so the war continued, on the ground, in the air, and now, in words that killed as surely as bullets. The guns did not fall silent in 1951, nor in 1952. Instead, the Korean War entered its most grinding phase, a war fought both in trenches and across conference tables, with victory slipping further out of reach for all involved. By 1952, the Korean War had already devoured years, millions of lives, and the fragile hopes of a divided nation. The battlefront barely shifted, yet the killing never stopped. The price of stalemate was written in blood. The human toll was staggering. When the final counts were tallied, more than 3 million people had perished, and the majority were civilians. Families who had survived Japanese occupation now endured bombardment from their own soil. Villages burned and rebuilt only to be destroyed again. Entire generations were uprooted. Children growing up in refugee camps, knowing war as their only world. The atrocities were not confined to one side. In the south, the government of Syngman Rhee carried out brutal purges, haunted by the fear of communist sympathizers. The Jeju Uprising was only the beginning. Across the countryside, suspected leftists were rounded up, executed, or buried in mass graves. Later investigations would conclude that the majority of war crimes in Korea, nearly 80%, were committed by Rhee's own forces. In the north, Kim Il-sung's regime showed equal ruthlessness. Civilians accused of aiding the South were imprisoned or executed. Political prisoners swelled the camps, where starvation and abuse claimed countless lives. China too became implicated, its volunteers accused of massacres during their offensives, their prisoners subjected to misery and freezing barracks. The United States, for its part, cloaked its own actions in silence. Bombing campaigns turned North Korea into a wasteland. Cities like Pyongyang, Wonsan, and Hamhung were reduced to rubble, their survivors huddling in caves and tunnels to escape the firestorms above. U.S. commanders later admitted there was little left to destroy. Yet when accusations of American atrocities surfaced, such as massacres of refugees mistaken for infiltrators, the government denied them, even as survivors told their stories for decades afterward. The war was not just a clash of armies, but of propaganda. Each side magnified the crimes of the other while burying its own. Leaflets fluttered across no man's land, promising liberation or condemning betrayal. Loudspeakers broadcast insults and slogans through the night. Soldiers fought in the mud by day, then endured psychological war by dusk. And through it all, civilians carried the heaviest burden. Refugees stumbled south with nothing but their clothes, only to find themselves uprooted again as the front shifted. Families were split forever by the DMZ that hardened in blood, parents dying without knowing the fate of children lost to the other side. By 1953, Koreans had endured 3 years of hell, only to see their land divided exactly as it had been in 1945. For them, the cost of war was not measured in maps or treaties, but in graves, scars, and silences. The peninsula itself seemed broken, its mountains blackened by fire, its rivers choked with debris, its people left to mourn a peace that had no meaning. The Korean War was never just a conflict of armies. It was a human catastrophe, one where ideology demanded sacrifice, and ordinary people became its offering. On July 27, 1953, after more than 2 years of talks and 3 years of slaughter, the guns finally fell silent. An armistice was signed at Panmunjom, establishing a ceasefire along the same weary line where the war had begun, the 38th parallel. The agreement created a buffer zone, a demilitarized strip of land bristling with barbed wire and watchtowers. It was not peace, only a pause. And technically, the Korean War has never ended. North and South remain at war to this day. For the soldiers who had endured the trenches, the armistice brought no triumph. There were no parades, no surrender ceremonies. Instead, there was exhaustion. Men who had fought on Heartbreak Ridge or Porkchop Hill walked away with hollow eyes, knowing their sacrifices had preserved a stalemate. All that blood, one veteran later said, just to stay where we started. For Korea itself, the cost was unimaginable. 3 million dead. Cities reduced to ashes. Families permanently divided by a border that could not be crossed. The wounds ran deeper than politics. Children raised without fathers. Villages erased. songs and letters lost to censorship and fear. In Seoul, in Pyongyang, in every village between, the war left a silence that still lingers. Yet in the world beyond, the Korean War slipped quickly into shadow. In the United States, it was dubbed the Forgotten War. It lacked the clean victory of World War II or the fiery protests of Vietnam. It was messy, indecisive, and shrouded in Cold War ambiguity. Politicians spoke of it as a police action. Historians filed it away as a proxy conflict. But for those who lived through it, there was nothing forgettable about it. The war reshaped the world. It cemented the Cold War divide in Asia, binding South Korea to the United States and drawing North Korea into the orbit of China and the Soviet Union. It transformed Japan into America's forward base in the Pacific. It proved that nuclear powers could clash by proxy, spilling oceans of blood without crossing into direct confrontation. And above all, it froze a nation in time. Korea, once a single country, remained split in two, a division that persists into the 21st century. Families separated in 1950 still wait for reunions that may never come. Along the DMZ, soldiers still stand watch, facing each other across a scar cut into their homeland 70 years ago. The Korean War may be forgotten in the headlines, overshadowed by louder conflicts, but it has never ended. Its legacy lives on in every checkpoint along the DMZ, in every family photograph torn in half, in every echo of artillery that once thundered across a peninsula that longed to be whole. The Forgotten War is not forgotten by those who paid its price.